fresh developments aimed squarely at Moscow. NATO chief Mark Rutte has unveiled a new mission designed to deter any more Russian drone incursions into NATO countries.
As Russian incursions appear to grow more frequent, Baltic countries are stepping up efforts to protect their airspace, turning to drones as a key solution. Latvia has emerged as Europe's drone powerhouse, leading NATO's drone coalition for Ukraine.
From Saab and seemingly the government of Sweden and maybe even the royal family try to get Canada to purchase their Gripen fighter jet.
For years, the Gripen was treated like the clever underdog of Western air power, admired by engineers, respected by pilots, but never feared by rivals. It wasn't the jet that dominated headlines or threatened the balance of power. It was simply reliable, inexpensive, and good enough. At least that's what everyone believed, until a sudden unexplained jump in its performance forced NATO analysts to ask a question they had never asked before. What exactly had Sweden done to this aircraft? That image began to change quietly, almost silently, as Swedish engineers recognized that the Gripen E still had untapped potential buried deep within its systems. That hidden potential could only be reached if the aircraft's engine architecture was refined from the inside out. And so, a project began behind closed doors, one that would eventually ripple across NATO and unsettle analysts who believed they understood exactly what the Gripen was capable of. The surprise came not from Sweden alone, but from a partner that seemed unlikely at first glance. Rolls-Royce, a name most people associate with handcrafted luxury cars, but whose aerospace division carries decades of expertise in propulsion design, had quietly stepped into the shadows of the Gripen program. The public never saw the partnership forming, and even within NATO, very few knew it was happening. Rolls-Royce did not redesign the engine itself, since the Gripen uses a GE-built F414. Instead, they focused on what happens around that core. The airflow channels the thermal layers, the small tolerance components, the digital systems that control how the engine breathes, all became the canvas for Rolls-Royce to reshape. These upgrades were nearly invisible from the outside, which was exactly the point. Sweden wanted the aircraft to evolve without waving a flag about it. The first transformation came through heat reduction. Modern aerial warfare is no longer fought with radar alone. Infrared sensors on missiles, drones, and satellites now track heat with frightening accuracy. A fighter that glows too brightly on the infrared spectrum is a fighter that dies early. By reworking how heat traveled inside the engine rolls, Royce helped push the Gripen E's thermal signature down to levels NATO had never recorded from a single engine aircraft. Test sensors flagged the first readings as errors. Technicians recalibrated them, then tested again, and once again the Gripen appeared far cooler than expected. It was a single-engine jet, behaving like a stealth twin-engine design. That anomaly reverberated through NATO's intelligence community, and questions began to circulate quietly. The second major upgrade came from how the engine used fuel. By refining airflow and adjusting internal pathways, Rolls-Royce helped the Gripen stretch its operational range far beyond its original projections. Suddenly, the jet could fly distances usually reserved for heavier, costlier fighters. Nations with large patrol areas, especially those with remote northern airspace like Canada, were stunned to see a relatively light fighter matching the endurance of far larger platforms. Sweden kept these findings quiet for obvious reasons. Yet even with limited data shared, NATO eventually pieced together what had happened. The Gripen E had evolved into something far beyond the category it had occupied for decades. Not a budget fighter, not a mid-tier option, but a platform that sat closer to the level of jets costing several times its price. None of the upgrades altered the engine's outward appearance. On paper, the fighter still looked unchanged, which made the discovery even more unsettling. NATO's technical committee reviewing Sweden's logs realized that a new kind of aircraft was emerging, one that did not fit neatly into the established hierarchy of Western fighters. Rolls-Royce had quietly introduced a system that stabilized thrust at high altitudes, using internal components that adjusted airflow pressure in real time. These microscopic adjustments gave the Gripen a smoother climb rate and improved fuel use at thin air altitudes. The aircraft now held altitude profiles normally reserved for advanced stealth jets or twin-engine platforms. Another subtle enhancement reduced how the engine generated noise in certain frequencies. This was not meant to make the plane quiet to human ears, but to confuse acoustic tracking drones that rely on sound fingerprints to identify incoming aircraft. When NATO analysts tested the Gripen's acoustic signature, many drones failed to classify the fighter at all. But what truly shifted NATO's conversations came next. Rolls-Royce integrated a thermal intelligence loop into the digital control system. The engine could sense potential hotspots and adjust cooling paths on its own in fractions of a second. In real combat, this meant the fighter could automatically reduce its heat signature faster than a human pilot could react, making infrared-guided missile locks far less reliable. It was no longer just a more efficient Gripen. It had become an unpredictable target. By the time these capabilities leaked into NATO discussions, it became clear that Sweden had kept even its own political leadership partially unaware of the depth of Rolls-Royce's modifications. NATO members began sending formal inquiries to Sweden, trying to understand why the Gripen's performance no longer matched the documentation shared with alliance partners. Inside Washington, the discussions turned even more serious. U.S. officials warned that the Gripen E was evolving into a strategic wildcard. It was affordable enough for smaller countries to buy, yet its new performance made it capable of threatening airspaces usually protected by far more advanced systems. Worst of all, the upgrades were internal, invisible, and nearly impossible to monitor. Rolls-Royce had not only improved the engine, they had rewritten the idea of what internal optimization could accomplish for modern air combat. All of these shifts were achieved without exotic materials or visible modifications, only intelligence precision and quiet engineering. This created an internal conversation that many NATO planners were not prepared to have. If a mid-sized air force like Sweden could quietly leapfrog decades of technological hierarchy, what would stop larger nations from bypassing legacy systems entirely? Meanwhile, international interest in the Gripen surged. Countries that once dismissed it as too lightweight now requested private briefings. Air forces that had relied on bulkier fighters were suddenly eager to learn more. But Sweden kept the most sensitive upgrades classified. By the time NATO understood what had happened, the Gripen E was no longer competing with other light fighters. It was challenging an entire philosophy of air dominance. A small nation had proven that innovation, not size, determines the future. When NATO finally pieced together how the Gripen E had changed, it was too late. The aircraft had already triggered a shift in strategy procurement and threat analysis. It showed that the next era of air combat wouldn't be determined by who spends the most, but by who understands their machine at the deepest level. Now, a single question follows every classified meeting on European air defense. If the Gripen E was only the first step, what will Sweden build next?